The morning of September 16th, 1944 came to East Prussia, the way all mornings came to Wolf's Lair, gray, cold, and smelling of concrete and pine resin, and something else underneath, something that had no name, but that every man who worked in that complex recognized instinctively. Fear, perhaps, or its more sophisticated cousin. The constant, low-frequency awareness that the wrong word spoken in the wrong moment could end everything. General Heinz Guderian woke before dawn. He had not slept well. He rarely slept well anymore. At 56, he carried the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent 3 years watching everything he built be slowly, systematically destroyed. Not by the enemy, though the enemy had done his share, but by the decisions of a single man who had stopped listening to anyone who told him the truth. He sat on the edge of his cot in the small officers' quarters assigned to him at Wolf's Lair and looked at his hands in the gray pre-dawn light. Thick hands, strong hands, still, though the joints ached now in cold weather. The hands of a man who had grown up wanting to be a soldier, who had studied war the way other men studied music or mathematics, who had seen in the armored tank not just a weapon, but a revolution in human thought about how wars could be fought and won. Those hands had written Achtung Panzer in 1937. A book, a blueprint, a vision of mobile warfare so radical that most of his superiors had dismissed it as fantasy. Those hands had pointed at maps in 1940 and said, "Here through the Ardennes, where they will never expect us, or where the terrain itself will be our ally because no one believes tanks can move through forests." And the tanks had moved. God help them. The tanks had moved, and France had fallen in 6 weeks, and for a brief, dizzying moment, it had seemed that Guderian's vision of war, fast, fluid, decisive, merciful in its speed compared to the grinding slaughter of the last war, might actually make the world a different place. That was 4 years ago. He stood and walked to the small window. Outside, the forest pressed close against the compound's fences, the same dark pine forest that surrounded Wolf's Lair on all sides, that Hitler had chosen deliberately because its density made aerial reconnaissance difficult. Birds were beginning to call in the pre-dawn darkness. Somewhere beyond those trees, beyond the minefields and the wire and the anti-aircraft batteries, the world was continuing without caring in the slightest about the decisions being made inside this concrete complex. Guderian had arrived at Wolf's Lair the previous afternoon, summoned for what had been described as a routine briefing. He had been Chief of Staff of the Army High Command for 2 months now, responsible for the Eastern Front, inheriting a situation that could most charitably be described as catastrophic. The briefing was supposed to cover the usual topics: forced dispositions, supply situations, the state of various defensive lines. Routine. That was the word they had used. But Guderian had spent enough years in Hitler's orbit to know that nothing at Wolf's Lair was ever truly routine. Every meeting carried the possibility of sudden, violent change. Every briefing could become the moment when your career ended, or worse. He had learned this lesson twice already. He had the scars to prove it. He dressed slowly, methodically, the way soldiers learn to dress when they have been doing it for decades. Each button, each strap, each piece of equipment placed with the automatic precision of muscle memory. He checked his reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. Gray at the temples now, lines around the eyes that hadn't been there in 1940. The face of a man who had lived inside a catastrophe long enough to begin resembling it. He picked up the briefing documents from the small desk, and the complex sprawled across 3 concentric security zones deep in the forests near Rastenburg in East Prussia. Over 2,000 people living and working in a network of bunkers, barracks, support facilities, and command centers, all hidden under camouflage netting and artificial trees, all protected by minefields and wire, and guard posts and the layered paranoia of a regime that had recently discovered just how many of its own people wanted it dead. 2 months earlier, on July 20th, a bomb had exploded in a briefing room less than 200 meters from where Guderian now walked. The bomb had been placed by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, a decorated officer who had lost an eye and his right hand and 2 fingers of his left hand fighting in North Africa. A man who had given so much of his body to Germany that he had presumably earned the right to have opinions about whether Germany's leadership deserved his continued loyalty. He had decided it did not. He had placed a briefcase containing nearly a kilogram of plastic explosive under the conference table, directly beneath the map board where Hitler stood to receive his daily briefings. The table leg had deflected the blast. 4 men died. Hitler survived. What followed had been, by any measure, one of the most savage internal purges in German military history. Over 7,000 people had been arrested in the weeks after July 20th. Nearly 5,000 were executed. The executions were not simply shootings. The regime wanted suffering, wanted examples, wanted every officer in the German military to understand precisely what happened to people who thought the wrong thoughts. Men were hanged with piano wire at Plötzensee prison, suspended from meat hooks, strangled slowly over many minutes while cameras recorded every moment. Hitler watched the films reportedly more than once, and reportedly with satisfaction. The effect on the men who remained, the generals and colonels and staff officers who had not been involved in the plot, but who now existed under the permanent shadow of suspicion, was difficult to overstate. Every man who entered Hitler's presence did so, knowing that loyalty was no longer assumed, but demanded, performed, demonstrated constantly through word and gesture and expression. Yet a face that seemed insufficiently enthusiastic could be noticed. A hesitation before agreeing could be remembered. A question that sounded too much like doubt could be reported. Guderian himself had been appointed to the Court of Honor, the military tribunal that formally expelled accused officers from the Wehrmacht before delivering them to Roland Freisler's People's Court, where the predetermined verdicts were delivered at full volume by a judge who screamed abuse at men who were not permitted to defend themselves and who were then taken out and hanged. Guderian had sat on that court. He had voted for expulsions. He had helped deliver men he had known for years into the hands of people who killed them. He had done it to protect himself. Walking through the Wolf's Lair compound in the early morning of September 16, 1944, he carried that knowledge in his chest like a stone he could not set down. It did not make him a villain in his own accounting. The Court of Honor had been a trap with no clean exit, a mechanism designed precisely to implicate as many senior officers as possible in the suppression of the conspiracy, so that their collective guilt would bind them to the regime by the logic of shared crime. He understood this. He had understood it when he accepted the appointment. Understanding it did not make the stone lighter. The daily Führer conference was scheduled for the early afternoon, but Guderian arrived at the main operations building well before noon. He had learned long ago that arriving early allowed him a few minutes to assess the room, the maps. See, the mood of the staff officers who always arrived before the principals. Men whose faces often told you more about what was coming than any briefing document. What he found when he walked into the conference anteroom stopped him at the door. The maps had been laid out already on the large conference table. Standard practice. The maps were always prepared in advance. The relevant fronts marked with the latest intelligence, the dispositions of forces indicated with the various markers and overlays that made the abstract reality of war legible to men who directed it from hundreds of miles away. But the map that had been placed at the center of the table, the map given the position of primary emphasis, the map that would face Hitler directly when he stood at his customary position, was not the Eastern Front. It was not the Western Front either. At least not the main Allied line pushing toward the German border from France and Belgium. It was the Ardennes, a detailed topographic map of the forested highland region where Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany converged, where the dense forest in deep river valleys and narrow roads created terrain that military planners conventionally dismissed as unsuitable for large-scale armored operations. Guderian stood very still and looked at that map. He knew the Ardennes. He knew it the way a craftsman knows the tool he designed himself. In the spring of 1940, when the Wehrmacht's planners were debating where to strike the decisive blow against France, Guderian had argued with a ferocity that alarmed his superiors for a thrust directly through that impossible terrain. Swore everyone had told him it couldn't be done. The forests were too dense. The roads were too narrow. Tanks couldn't operate in those conditions. The flanks would be exposed. The logistics were impossible. Guderian had looked at those objections and seen in each of them not reasons to abandon the plan, but reasons why the French would never expect it. He had been right. The panzers had moved through the Ardennes in May 1940 like a blade through cloth. The French and British armies, expecting the attack further north, had been caught completely off balance. The breakthrough at Sedan had opened the way to the English Channel. France had fallen. And now, 4 years later, standing in the anteroom of Hitler's conference room on a cold September morning, Guderian looked at a map of those same forests and felt something settle into place in his understanding. A cold, terrible clarity, the recognition of a pattern before it had been spoken aloud. He knew before a single word had been said, before Hitler had entered the room, before the briefing had begun, exactly what was coming. He knew because he knew those forests. He knew the roads, the river crossings, the way the terrain channeled movement and created bottlenecks that could trap armored columns for hours. He knew what had made the 1940 operation possible: the element of surprise, the unpreparedness of the enemy, the speed that had prevented any coherent response. And he knew, with the certainty of a man who had spent his professional life thinking about nothing else, that every one of those factors no longer existed. So the Allied armies facing Germany in the fall of 1944 were not the stunned, divided forces of 1940. They were battle-hardened veterans who had been fighting and winning for 2 years. They had complete air superiority. They had secure supply lines running back to the ports of Normandy and Antwerp. They had commanders who had learned, through blood and experience, how to respond rapidly to German armored thrusts. And Germany, the Germany of September 1944, was not the Germany of May 1940. It was not the Germany that had crossed the Meuse at Sedan with fresh divisions and full fuel tanks and the confidence of a force that had never known defeat. It was a Germany that had watched 400,000 men disappear into the Soviet summer offensive. A Germany that had seen its armies in France shattered at the Falaise pocket, and its Luftwaffe bled white over Normandy, its synthetic fuel plants systematically destroyed by Allied bombers. A Germany that was fielding divisions, manned increasingly by boys of 16 and men of 60, formations that existed more on paper than in reality, units with official designations and almost nothing else. Guderian stood at that map for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he walked to the far wall, stood with his back to it, and waited for the others to arrive. Alfred Jodl came in at noon, punctual as always, carrying his leather briefing folder under one arm. At 54, Jodl was the chief of operations for the Armed Forces High Command. Hitler's chief military planner, in practical terms, the man responsible for translating the Führer's strategic visions into operational directives that actual soldiers could attempt to execute. He was, by any objective measure, a highly capable officer. He had graduated at the top of his class from the Bavarian War Academy. He spoke French and Italian. He understood logistics and terrain and the relationship between operational planning and the grinding physical reality of how armies actually moved and fought and consumed supplies. In a different army, in a different war, he might have been celebrated as a model staff officer. But Jodl had spent the war at Wolf's Lair, close to power, close to Hitler, and the proximity had changed him in ways that he perhaps did not fully recognize in himself. He had learned to present bad news in packages that minimized its impact. He had learned which questions to ask and which to avoid. He had learned that the man he served did not want accurate information so much as he wanted information that confirmed what he already believed. And Jodl had become expert at the subtle art of providing exactly that while technically telling the truth. He had signed the Commissar order directing German forces to execute captured Soviet political officers immediately without trial. He had signed the commando order directing that Allied special operations soldiers captured behind German lines be killed rather than taken prisoner. He had put his name to directives that had resulted in the deaths of thousands of people who had every right under the laws of war to be treated as prisoners. He had done these things not from cruelty, but from the far more common and in some ways more troubling motivation of professional survival. The desire to remain useful, to remain in the room where decisions were made, to preserve his position and his influence by never allowing his disagreement to become more important than his cooperation. He entered the conference room, glanced at the Ardennes map on the table, and his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Something moved behind his eyes, recognition perhaps, or calculation. He looked at Guderian standing against the far wall, and the two men exchanged a glance that contained everything and committed to nothing. Jodl set his briefing folder on the table. He did not reach into it for the 12 pages of analysis he had prepared. The careful, a documented assessment of Germany's operational situation that concluded in measured professional language that any major offensive in the West exceeded Germany's current capabilities by a margin that could not be overcome by tactical skill or force of will. He had written those 12 pages. He had brought them. He looked at the map on the table and at Guderian, and he left the folder closed. Wilhelm Keitel arrived minutes later. Field Marshal Keitel, at 62, was the chief of the Armed Forces High Command, theoretically the senior military officer in Germany, the man whose authority over Wehrmacht operations was second only to Hitler himself. In practice, his authority extended precisely as far as Hitler wished it to extend, and no further. He was, in the assessment of virtually every officer who worked with him, a man who had traded his professional judgment for the safety of proximity to power. His fellow officers called him Laquetel, a play on words, lakai in German meaning lackey, the kind of man who carries someone else's coat and considers it an honor. The nickname was not affectionate. It was contemptuous, and it was accurate. Keitel had once tried to object to Hitler's decisions. During the planning for Operation Barbarossa in 1941, he had raised concerns about invading the Soviet Union. Legitimate concerns, as it turned out, concerns that history would fully vindicate. Hitler had responded with such fury that Keitel had offered his resignation. It was refused, and Keitel had learned his lesson so completely that he never offered another genuine objection for the remainder of the war. He became instead a man whose primary function was to stand at attention, agree with whatever was said, and sign whatever was placed before him. He looked at the Ardennes map and nodded slightly, as if confirming something to himself, and took his position to the left of the table without speaking. Werner Kreipe came in last, still slightly unfamiliar with the rhythms of this room. At 40, he was the youngest man present by over a decade, newly appointed as Chief of Staff of the Luftwaffe after his predecessor had been killed in the July 20th bombing. He was a career Air Force officer, a competent man who had commanded bomber groups in the campaigns over France and the Low Countries, but who was still finding his footing in the complex political environment of Hitler's headquarters. He carried with him a small leather notebook, a habit he had maintained throughout his career, a record-keeper's instinct to write things down. Perhaps Göring, his nominal superior, had instructed him to report comprehensively on everything Hitler said. Perhaps it was simply his nature. Whatever the reason, Kreipe's notebook and the diary he maintained from its contents would become, in the years after the war, one of the most important primary sources for understanding what happened at Wolf's Lair in the fall of 1944. He found a position near the far end of the table, opened his notebook to a fresh page, and wrote the date, September 16th, 1944. He looked up and caught Guderian watching him. Guderian said nothing. He simply held the younger man's gaze for a moment, then looked away. It was not an unfriendly look. It was the look of a man recognizing, in another, someone who understood that what was about to happen deserved to be recorded. They waited. Waiting for Hitler was an experience that had its own particular texture. The combination of enforced patience and suppressed anxiety that came from never knowing quite when he would arrive, never knowing what mood he would bring with him, never being able to predict whether the man who entered the room would be expansive and rhetorical or quiet and cold, or, in the mode that had become increasingly common since July 20th, brittle and suspicious, looking for signs of insufficient loyalty in every face. The Wolf's Lair had been Hitler's primary residence for most of the war. Over 800 days spent in this complex, more time than in any other location. And he had watched his empire expand from these rooms. He had received the news of France's fall here, the news of the first victories in Russia, the reports of Rommel's advances in North Africa. He had also received, in more recent years, the other news: Stalingrad, Tunisia, the fall of Sicily, the Allied landings in Normandy, the collapse in France, the destruction of Army Group Center. He had stopped leaving the compound except for rare, carefully staged appearances. He no longer visited the front lines, no longer saw the burned cities or the hospital wards or the faces of soldiers who had spent 3 winters in Russian foxholes. He existed in a world of maps and briefings and the filtered reports of men who had learned that accurate information was the fastest route to being dismissed or worse. His daily routine had become nocturnal, where he would wake around 10 in the morning, walk with his German Shepherd Blondie, and receive his first briefings in the early afternoon. These conferences could last for hours, punctuated by lengthy monologues about German history, the injustice of Versailles, and the great destinies of peoples in the cosmic struggle he had appointed himself to resolve. His hands trembled visibly now, a tremor that his personal physician treated with a cocktail of medications whose full contents were not disclosed to the generals who stood close enough to observe it. Some attributed the tremor to Parkinson's disease. Others believed it was the legacy of the July bombing, the physical damage of a man whose body had absorbed the shock of an explosion at close range. Whatever the cause, the tremor was real. And the men who watched it had learned to look away rather than let their observation be noticed. The door opened. Hitler entered without announcement, the way he always entered, not because he wanted to be informal, but because he had long since moved past the conventions of men who needed to be announced. He was followed by 2 aides who positioned themselves near the walls and did not speak. He was wearing his standard uniform, the gray service coat, the iron cross at his throat, the small party badge. He walked to the table. He looked at the maps. He looked at the 4 men arranged around the room. Keitel standing at attention, Jodl with his hands folded, Kripe with his notebook open, Guderian against the wall with his arms at his sides. And Hitler smiled. It was a thin, private smile. In the smile of a man who has been carrying a secret and is about to share it on his own terms, at a moment of his own choosing. Guderian watched that smile and felt the stone in his chest grow heavier. He had seen that smile before. He had seen it in 1940, before France. He had seen it in 1941, before Russia. He had seen it every time Hitler was about to commit to a course of action that no one else in the room could yet see, every time the invisible machinery of his conviction had reached some internal threshold and resolved into a decision. The difference, the terrible, consequential difference, was that in 1940 and 1941, that smile had preceded victories. Costly victories, imperfect victories, victories purchased at prices that even then raised questions about whether the accounting was sound, but victories nonetheless. The events that confirmed, for the men who served him, that perhaps his instincts were worth trusting, that perhaps the professional soldier's caution was too conservative. Those victories were 4 years in the past. Guderian looked at Hitler's smile in September 1944, and what he saw was not the smile of a man who had seen clearly what others could not see. What he saw was the smile of a man who had stopped needing evidence, who had moved to a place where the size of his conviction substituted for the quality of his information, who believed in some profound and unchallengeable way that his will was sufficient, that if he wanted something badly enough, reality would accommodate him. The briefing began with Jodl running through the standard situation report. 96 Allied divisions at or near the front in the West, on 55 German divisions to oppose them, most under strength, many barely functional. Allied airborne units in reserve, ongoing fuel shortages, losses in equipment that exceeded replacement rates across virtually every category. Jodl knew how to present these numbers. He had spent years learning the precise calibration required, how to mention the shortages without lingering on them, how to note the disparity in forces without letting the full weight of what that disparity meant settle into the room and take hold. Hitler listened without interrupting. Then he raised one hand. The room went quiet. He looked down at the map. His hand descended slowly until his extended finger rested on the table, pressed against the topographic contour lines and the forest markings of a region that Heinz Guderian knew like the landscape of his own memory. The Ardennes. "I have just made a momentous decision," Hitler said. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, the voice of a man discussing something he had already finished thinking about. "I shall go over to the counterattack." He paused. Let that settle. "Here," he said, the finger pressed down. "Out of the Ardennes, with the objective, Antwerp." Guderian had known it was coming. He had known it from the moment he saw the map laid out on that table. He had been preparing himself for this moment since he walked through the door, steeling himself against the shock of hearing it said aloud. He was wrong to think preparation would be enough. And hearing it said, hearing those words in that voice with that certainty, hearing the name of a city 125 miles away, spoken as if it were already captured, as if the forests and the rivers and the Allied armies and the absent fuel and the exhausted men were details to be handled rather than obstacles to be reckoned with, was different from knowing it was coming. The reality of it hit him in a way the anticipation had not. 11 seconds of silence followed. Kripa counted them. He wrote the number in his notebook. In those 11 seconds, Guderian did something he had not done in years. He did the calculation in his head, quickly, automatically, the way a man who has spent his life thinking about armored warfare calculates without being asked. Fuel consumption per kilometer for armored columns moving through forested terrain with limited road access, multiplied by the number of divisions required for an operation of this scale, divided by Germany's current fuel production and allocation capacity. The number he arrived at was not even close to possible. Not close to possible if everything went perfectly. Not close to possible if the weather cooperated fully and Allied air power was grounded for the entire operation. Not close to possible if German forces captured Allied fuel dumps intact at every step of the advance. Not possible, and yet the finger remained on the map, pressing down on the Ardennes with the certainty of a man who had stopped asking whether things were possible. Guderian looked at the man across that map and understood something that he had been approaching for a long time, but had not, until this moment, fully arrived at. This was not strategic miscalculation. This was not overconfidence, the familiar flaw of successful commanders who had won too often and begun to trust their instincts past the point where instincts remained reliable. This was something else entirely. A man who had crossed a line between bad judgment and the absence of judgment, between arrogance and the complete dissolution of the mechanism by which a person tests their beliefs against external reality. Hitler had not merely decided that the Ardennes offensive was possible. He had moved to a place where the question of possibility was no longer relevant, where the decision itself was the answer to any objection, where willing something to be true was sufficient grounds for proceeding as if it were. And standing in that room, in that concrete bunker, in that forest, Guderian thought of the men who would be ordered to execute this plan, the soldiers in their foxholes along the Our and the Sauer rivers, the tank crews who would be told to advance through forests he knew, toward a city he knew was unreachable, on fuel he knew did not exist. He thought of them. He carried the weight of knowing what was coming for them, and then he prepared to do what he had done before, and what he had paid for before, and what every bone in his experienced, exhausted, morally compromised body told him he had to do. He prepared to speak. The finger remained on the map. Outside, the pine forest pressed against the wire, and in the silence that followed those 11 counted seconds, the last great catastrophe of the Third Reich began its long, inevitable journey toward the frozen forests of Belgium. But before that journey could begin, 4 men had to leave a room, and each of them would carry something out of it that they had not brought in. Not orders, not plans, not the operational details that would be worked out in the weeks ahead, but something heavier and less definable. The particular weight of knowing, the specific burden of having been present at the moment when a decision was made that would cost more than 100,000 lives, and having said what could be said, and having watched it accomplish nothing. That weight had a name, though none of them would have used it in those terms. It was the weight of being the last honest men in a room that had stopped wanting honesty, and it would not leave them. Not in the weeks of preparation that followed, not in the frozen forests of the Ardennes when the reckoning finally came, not in the years after when survivors wrote their memoirs and constructed their legacies and drew lines through the pages they could not afford to leave. Some weights, once picked up, cannot be set down again. Guderian knew this. He had known it since 1941, since the first time he had told the truth and paid for it. He knew it as he stood against that wall and watched the finger press down on the map and felt the stone in his chest settle into the permanent position it would occupy for the rest of the war. He knew it, and he spoke anyway, because that was what the knowing required. The finger remained on the map. Hitler had not moved it, had not lifted it or shifted it or gestured with it towards some other point that might modify or qualify what he had just said. The finger simply rested there, pressed against the paper contours of the Ardennes forest, with the calm finality of a man who had finished thinking and moved entirely into the territory of deciding. Antwerp. The word hung in the air of that concrete room, the way certain words do. Words that carry so much weight that they change the atmosphere around them, that make the air itself feel different after they have been spoken. Antwerp was 125 miles from the German lines in the west. 125 miles of forest and river and road network, and Allied supply lines and American and British divisions that had been fighting and winning for 2 years and had no intention of stopping. Guderian broke the silence, not with objection, not with the direct, blunt challenge that his instincts demanded and that his experience had taught him to suppress. He broke it with a question, a technical question, the kind a professional soldier asks when he is trying to understand an operational plan, the kind of question that contains within its structure all the objections he cannot state directly. Mein Führer, he said. His voice was level. He had practiced level. The armored columns will require substantial fuel resources for a sustained advance through difficult terrain. What allocation figures are we working from? The question was precise. It was professionally phrased. It was on its surface nothing more than a staff officer asking for the logistical foundation of a proposed operation. The kind of question that should be asked, that had to be asked, that any serious military planner would consider essential before committing forces to movement. Hitler answered without consulting anyone, without looking at Jodl or at Keitel or at the supply figures that Jodel's staff had prepared. He looked at Guderian and produced a number with the confidence of a man reciting something he knew absolutely. The number was wrong, not approximately wrong, not the kind of wrong that comes from rounding or from optimistic assumptions about road conditions or column efficiency. Wrong by a factor of 2. Wrong in a way that could not be explained by any reasonable interpretation of the available data, because the data did not support the number regardless of how generously it was read. Guderian held Hitler's gaze and did the arithmetic in his head with the automatic speed of a man who had been doing this arithmetic for 30 years. The number Hitler had given would not move the required forces to the Meuse River, let alone to Antwerp. It would not complete half the operation under ideal conditions. Under realistic conditions, winter weather, Allied interdiction, the friction that attends all military operations regardless of how well they are planned, it would not sustain the advance through the opening phase. But what Guderian understood in that moment, what settled into him with a cold precision that was somehow worse than anger, was not simply that Hitler had given a wrong number. It was that Hitler did not know the number was wrong, not because he lacked access to the correct figures. The correct figures existed. Jodel's staff had prepared them. The supply directorate had calculated them. The numbers were available to anyone who wanted them. Hitler had not been shielded from the truth by incompetent staff work or deliberate deception. He had been shielded from it by himself. Somewhere in the past year, in the accumulated weight of defeats he could not accept, and realities he could not incorporate, and information that contradicted the narrative his mind required, Hitler had stopped checking. Hitler had stopped the internal process by which a person in authority takes what they believe and tests it against what the evidence shows and adjusts, however reluctantly, when the two diverge. He had stopped that process so completely that he could now produce numbers from memory that bore no relationship to documented reality, and produce them with the unshakable confidence of a man who had never been wrong. This was the end of strategy, the place where belief had fully replaced analysis, where the map on the table was no longer a representation of terrain and forces and distances and logistical constraints, but had become something else entirely, a canvas for a vision that existed independently of any of those things, that would not be modified by them, that had ceased to require their cooperation. Guderian said nothing more in that moment. He nodded slightly and looked at the map, and behind his level expression, he was doing what experienced soldiers do when they understand that the battle they are in is not the battle they prepared for. He was recalibrating. The briefing continued for another 2 hours. Jodl presented the operational concept in the measured, precise language he had developed over years of translating Hitler's instincts into military directives. The attack would come in late November or early December, when winter weather would ground Allied air forces. 25 divisions would be assembled in secret behind the Ardennes front. The main effort would strike through the weakest point in the American line, which Allied commanders had left lightly held because they, like their predecessors in 1940, had considered the terrain unsuitable for major operations. From the Ardennes, the armored spearheads would drive northwest, cross the Meuse River, and advance on Antwerp. If the operation succeeded, it would cut off the entire British and Canadian force group in the north from American forces to the south. It would deprive the Allies of their most important supply port. And it might. Hitler's voice took on a particular quality when he reached this part, a quality that was not quite hope and not quite demand, but something combining elements of both. It might convince Britain and America that the war in the West could not be won at acceptable cost, persuading them to negotiate a separate peace that would free Germany to concentrate everything against the Soviet Union. Jodl spoke. Keitel nodded. The aides near the walls stood perfectly still. Kreipe wrote. Guderian listened and watched Hitler's face more than the map, and understood something that the others were either slower to grasp or had already grasped and processed past the point of visible reaction. The Fuhrer had already decided. This was not a briefing in any meaningful sense of the word. It was a pronouncement, an announcement of what had already been determined, dressed in the form of a briefing because the form was expected, and the reality underneath it, the reality of a man informing rather than consulting, was too stark to present without the borrowed clothing of professional process. The room was a trap with good manners. To object was to be disloyal. In the post-July 20th atmosphere that permeated every room in Wolf's Lair, his disloyalty was not merely a career risk. It was a survival risk. The executions at Plötzensee had already established the price of disloyalty with absolute clarity. Every man in the room carried that knowledge without needing to be reminded of it. To agree was to be complicit, and to say nothing was. Guderian understood this with the particular clarity of a man who had been there before, who had stood in rooms like this one, and made choices he had to live with afterward. To say nothing was also a form of agreement, a ratification through silence, an acceptance underwritten by the decision not to speak. There was no clean option. There was no position in that room that did not come with a cost. He raised his voice again. The Eastern Front, he said. The Soviets are concentrating substantial forces along the Vistula. The intelligence suggests a major offensive no later than January. He paused for precisely the right length of time, long enough to be clear, short enough not to seem like a challenge. Every division we move west is a division that is not defending against that offensive. Hitler looked at him. The look lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It was not the explosive rage that Guderian had experienced before. The eruptions that had characterized their confrontations in 1941 and 1942. The shouting that had left witnesses pale and shaking. It was something quieter than rage, and in its quietness somehow more alarming. It was the look of a man who had heard an objection and had already, before the objection finished being stated, classified it and set it aside. The East will hold, Hitler said. 3 words. The matter was closed. Guderian looked at the map. He thought about the men on the Eastern Front, the soldiers in their positions along the Vistula, the depleted divisions with their shortages of everything, the commanders who had been sending desperate requests for reinforcement for months. He thought about what a Soviet winter offensive would find when it struck those positions, and what it would mean when the reserves that might have slowed it were instead frozen in the forests of Belgium. He thought about all of this, and he said nothing more, because he understood with absolute clarity that he had reached the boundary, the place beyond which words accomplished nothing, the place where the only choices remaining were the ones that carried consequences he was not yet prepared to accept. He had been there before. He knew this territory. However, he said nothing more, and the briefing ended, and the men filed out, and each of them carried something with them that had not been there when they walked in. In the days that followed, the machinery of the offensive began to move. Jodl was given the task of developing the operational details, working with a small, carefully vetted staff whose members had been selected as much for their discretion as their competence. The circle of knowledge was kept deliberately small. Field commanders, who would actually execute the offensive, the men whose forces would have to achieve what the plan required, were not informed. They would not be told until the preparations were so far advanced that objection would be pointless. The offensive was given a code name, Christrose, Christmas Rose. Later it was changed to Wacht am Rhein. Watch on the Rhine. The new name was deliberately deceptive, suggesting defensive preparations along the Rhine rather than the offensive thrust through Belgium that was actually being planned. Signals traffic was crafted to reinforce this impression. Units moving into assembly areas were ordered to maintain strict radio silence. Vehicles moved only at night. Supply buildup was disguised as routine logistics activity. Jodel's staff worked with the thoroughness that characterized German operational planning at its best, and as they worked, they grew troubled. The distances were the first problem. 125 miles from the German start line to Antwerp, through terrain that the Germans themselves had designed for defensive use, along road networks that would create bottlenecks capable of immobilizing entire divisions, and across rivers whose crossing sites would be the targets of Allied air and artillery the moment the weather cleared. Each mile of advance would require fuel that the supply calculations showed was not available. Each mile of advance would lengthen supply lines that were already fragile. The fuel problem was not merely serious. It was, by any objective measure, fatal to the operation as designed. The offensive, as Hitler had described it, would require Germany to capture Allied fuel dumps intact, to overrun American supply points before they could be evacuated or destroyed, and to do so consistently at every stage of the advance. Because without captured fuel, the panzers would stop moving regardless of tactical success. This meant not just advancing quickly, but advancing faster than a professional, well-supplied, battle-experienced enemy could respond. The plan required everything to go right. Military plans that require everything to go right are not plans, they are wishes. Jodl knew this. His staff knew this. They produced their 5 alternative plans, each somewhat less ambitious than Hitler's original vision, each adjusting the objectives to bring them closer to something achievable with the forces and resources actually available, and prepared to present them. When the alternatives were laid before Hitler, he examined them with visible impatience. He moved through them quickly, dismissing each in turn, returning repeatedly to his original concept with the certainty of a man who had decided that the alternatives were not better plans but smaller ambitions, failures of nerve rather than adjustments of reality. He chose the most aggressive option available. He chose it not because it was the most likely to succeed, but because it was the most consistent with what he wanted to be true. Because it asked the most of German soldiers, and Hitler's faith in the German soldiers' capacity for the impossible had survived every disconfirmation that reality had provided, intact and undiminished. The Eastern Front continued to absorb Guderian's days and nights. Reports came in from his staff. Soviet force concentrations along the Vistula, new armies identified in the order of battle, signs of the massive logistical buildup that preceded major Soviet offensives. He compiled the data. He prepared assessments. He brought them to Hitler's briefings and presented them with the careful precision of a man making a case he knows may not be heard. He was not heard, or rather, he was heard in the sense that his words entered Hitler's ears, were processed by the remarkable mind behind those eyes, and were classified as the pessimism of a staff officer who did not understand the bigger picture, the kind of conservative thinking that had been wrong in 1940 and would be proven wrong again. Guderian persisted because persistence was what he had. He argued for every division, every tank battalion, every artillery unit that was earmarked for the Ardennes offensive. Each meeting left him with less than he needed. Each request was reduced or denied or deferred. The reserves were going west. The decision had been made. On the 22nd of October, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and Field Marshal Walter Model were finally informed of what had been planned for them. Rundstedt was 69 years old. He was the senior German field marshal on the Western Front, a man who had been fighting wars since before most of his current colleagues were born, who had commanded at every level from platoon to army group, who had seen the full arc of German military history from the Kaiser's army to the present wreckage. He had been retired twice by Hitler for speaking his mind, and recalled twice because the Wehrmacht needed his competence too badly to leave it in retirement. He read the plan with the deliberate patience of a man who did not allow his facial expressions to tell other people what he was thinking before he had finished thinking it. When he had finished reading, he set the document on the table, placed both hands flat beside it, and looked at the wall for a moment. "Sonia, while I recognize the operational concept," he said finally in the measured tones of a man selecting his words with surgical care, "all, absolutely all to conditions necessary for even the possibility of success are lacking." He said it once. He did not repeat it. He did not elaborate beyond what the situation required. He had been in the German army for long enough to understand that there were moments when the complete, documented statement of professional judgment was what honor required, regardless of whether it would be heard. Model was different. Walter Model, at 43, was the youngest field marshal in the German army, and perhaps the most aggressive. A commander who had earned his reputation by stabilizing crisis situations, by appearing at collapsing fronts, and somehow, more through force of will and tactical instinct and a complete disregard for his own safety, preventing disasters from becoming catastrophes. His troops called him Hitler's fireman. He wore the nickname without irony because he had earned it. He read the plan faster than Rundstedt. His reaction was more immediate. "This plan hasn't got a leg to stand on," he told his staff after the briefing, in the blunt operational language he preferred to diplomatic circumlocution. He pulled out his own maps and began working on an alternative immediately. The way a craftsman who has been given a defective tool reaches instinctively for one that will actually work. Model's alternative, which he called Herbstnebel, autumn mist, was a different kind of operation. Instead of driving all the way to Antwerp, it aimed to encircle American forces in the Aachen salient, cutting off and destroying the First Army without attempting to cross the Meuse River at all. It was an operation scaled to Germany's actual capabilities rather than Hitler's aspirations. It was, Model believed, something that might actually be achieved with the forces available. Rundstedt developed his own variant, Fall Martin, another limited operation aimed at realistic objectives. The two field marshals combined their proposals into what they called the Kleine Lösung, the small solution, and prepared to present it as a responsible alternative to the Große Lösung, the big solution that Hitler was demanding. Guderian supported them. He made the case from the Eastern Front perspective. Every armored division that crossed into the Ardennes was a division he could not use to slow the Soviet offensive he knew was coming. He laid out the intelligence assessments, the force comparisons, the timeline calculations showing that the Red Army would be ready to move no later than mid-January. He asked the question that the numbers demanded: what would be left to defend the East when the Soviets came? The three of them, Guderian, Model, Rundstedt, presented their case with the thoroughness of professional soldiers who had spent their careers learning that wars are won by logistics and terrain and the careful management of limited resources, not by willpower alone. Hitler listened. He let them finish. He maintained the appearance of consideration, the slight forward lean, the apparent attention, the silence that suggested the words were being weighed rather than merely endured. Then he raised one hand. "This plan," he said, "is not subject to alteration." 90 seconds. Kreipe later estimated, from what Guderian told him, that the formal consideration of the alternative proposals had lasted approximately 90 seconds. The Kleine Lösung was dead. What Guderian understood in the aftermath of that meeting, sitting alone in his quarters, the Eastern Front intelligence summaries spread across the desk before him, the numbers adding up to the same sum regardless of how many times he ran them, was something that went beyond the tactical and operational dimensions of the disaster he saw coming. He understood the trap. It had been there from the beginning, constructed so naturally from the existing architecture of the regime that it had the appearance of inevitability. Hitler had called them all in to hear the plan. He had allowed, performed, the ritual of consultation. Rundstedt and Model had presented their alternative, and the alternative had been heard, and now they had been present for the decision and could not pretend otherwise. This was the architecture of complicity, not the crude, obvious complicity of men who had enthusiastically supported criminal orders. This was something more refined, The complicity of professionals who had objected within the system, who had raised concerns through proper channels, who had submitted their reservations in writing, and who had then continued to function within the system when their reservations were overruled. What choice did they have? Now, Guderian had asked himself this question before. There was always a choice. That was the terrible thing. There was always a choice, and the choice always had costs, and the question was never whether the choice existed, but whether the person facing it was willing to bear the cost of the right one. Guderian looked at the Eastern Front summaries. He picked up his pen and wrote a memorandum. The memorandum was addressed to the Army High Command. It documented his assessment of the Eastern Front situation, the force levels required to defend against the anticipated Soviet offensive, and the gap between those requirements and the resources that would be available after the Ardennes operation consumed what little Germany had left in reserve. It used precise professional language. It stated facts and drew conclusions from them in the measured tones of a senior staff officer fulfilling his professional obligation to provide honest military assessment. It was, in the context of Wolf's Lair in the fall of 1944, a record, a statement that he had known and had said so, and the record would exist whether or not anyone acted on it. He filed it and went to bed. Kripe was gone by the 19th of September, 3 days after the briefing. Gone not because of anything he had said or done in that room. His conduct had been entirely correct, his notebook visible, but his opinions unspoken. But because of the complex, vicious internal politics of the Luftwaffe and the jealousy of a superior who had never been comfortable with subordinates who might be more capable than he was, von Göring had decided that Kripe was a threat to his position, and the machinery had moved with the efficiency that characterizes the elimination of those who displease the powerful. Kripe was informed that he was being reassigned. He handed over his duties and departed Wolf's Lair within 48 hours. He took his notebook with him. In the months that followed, the months of preparation and movement and the slow, secret assembly of the forces that would be thrown into the Ardennes, Kripe continued writing. Not from inside the decision-making rooms, as he had been in September, but from the periphery, from conversations with officers who had been there, from documents that passed through his hands, from the careful accumulation of information that a man with a recorder's instinct gathers even when he is no longer in the room where things happen. His diary documented what the official records did not, the doubts that were expressed in private and suppressed in official settings, the assessments that were submitted and overruled, the conversations between professionals who knew what was coming and had no mechanism for preventing it. He wrote it down because someone had to. On the evening of December 15, 1944, the night before the offensive began, Guderian found Model in a small room near the operations center. They did not speak for a long moment. Outside, the night was cold and clear, the kind of clear that would produce ground frost by morning and would be welcomed by the commanders who had been told that bad weather was essential to the operation's success. Model poured 2 cups of coffee from a battered metal pot. He handed one to Guderian without ceremony, the way soldiers share things when the social conventions of rank become irrelevant in the face of what is coming. They drank. "You know how this ends," Model said. It was not a question. Guderian looked at the dark coffee in his cup. He thought about the men in their assembly areas. 200,000 of them, at the latest count, waiting in the forest they had been secretly moved into over the past weeks. Young men and old men, and men who were neither but who had been used hard enough and long enough to have aged past their years. Men who had been told they were part of a decisive offensive that would change the course of the war, and who had perhaps believed it because soldiers need something to believe, and the alternative was to know what Guderian and Model knew. "Yes," he said. Model nodded. He looked at his coffee and then out the window at the cold, clear night. "I have positioned the divisions as well as they can be positioned," he said. "I have adjusted the axes of advance to account for the road limitations. I have tried to give this the best chance it can have given what it is." He paused. "It isn't enough." "No," Guderian said. "The Soviets. January at the latest. Possibly sooner." Model was quiet for a moment. Then, "When they come, what will you have to stop them with?" Guderian said nothing. That was the answer. Model finished his coffee and set the cup on the table. with the careful deliberateness of a man who is aware that ordinary actions may be running out. He stood and buttoned his coat and prepared to go back to the work of commanding an operation he had told anyone who would listen was doomed. At the door he stopped. "Write it down," he said. "All of it. What we said tonight. What we told them. What they decided." He looked back at Guderian with an expression that was not quite hope and not quite resignation, but something that lived in the space between them. "Someone needs to know that we knew." He left. Guderian sat alone with the cold coffee and the sound of 200,000 men somewhere in the dark forests preparing to move at dawn. He thought about Kripa and the notebook, Ina and the particular dignity of men who understand that bearing witness is sometimes the only form of resistance available. Outside, the night held its cold clarity, and somewhere in the forests that Heinz Guderian knew better than any other living man, the last great German offensive of the Second World War waited for dawn. Dawn came to the Ardennes on December 16, 1944, the way it always came to that forest in winter, slowly, reluctantly, as if the darkness were unwilling to release its hold on the trees. At 5:30 in the morning, before first light had fully separated the sky from the tree line, the guns opened. Over 1,000 artillery pieces fired simultaneously along an 80-mile front, and the sound was not like anything that can be adequately described to a person who has not stood within range of it. It was not loud in the way that individual explosions are loud. It was something larger than loudness, a physical event, a compression of air that could be felt in the chest, in the teeth, the base of the skull. A sound that erased all other sounds and replaced them with itself so completely that men who experienced it reported afterward that they could not remember what silence had felt like before it began. 200,000 German soldiers moved forward in the darkness. They came through the forest trails and the narrow roads and the frozen creek beds, infantry first, then the armor behind them, the tanks that represented the last serious armored reserve the German army possessed. Men and machines that had been hoarded for months, gathered in secret, moved at night. Were held back from the grinding attrition of the eastern and western fronts specifically for this moment. For the first hours, the offensive achieved something close to what Hitler had promised. The American forces holding the Ardennes sector were thin. Allied commanders had assessed the terrain exactly as German planners had hoped. As unsuitable for major operations, useful as a quiet sector where tired divisions could rest and new ones could receive their first experience of frontline conditions without being immediately destroyed. The 106th Infantry Division, barely a week in the line, occupied positions directly in the path of the main German thrust. They had not been there long enough to fully understand the ground they were defending. The Germans hit them in the dark, in the cold, sawn in the fog and snow that had arrived on schedule to ground Allied aircraft, and the results were immediate and devastating. The 106th lost 2 full regiments, nearly 9,000 men killed, wounded, or captured in the first 2 days, one of the most catastrophic single losses suffered by an American division in the entire war. The lines cracked. In multiple places, they simply ceased to exist, replaced by gaps through which German armor poured forward into the Belgian countryside. News of the advances reached Hitler's headquarters at Adlerhorst, the Eagle's Nest command complex near Bad Nauheim, where he had moved to direct the offensive from closer range. The reports were intoxicating. Miles gained, prisoners taken, American units in disarray. For a brief period, perhaps 48 hours, perhaps 72, the numbers on the map moved in the direction Hitler had demanded. Guderian received the same reports in his own headquarters, where he was managing the Eastern Front with resources that diminished by the hour as units continued to flow westward. He read the initial reports and felt nothing that resembled relief. He had been in enough campaigns to know the difference between tactical surprise, which is what the opening phase had achieved, and operational success, which required sustained momentum against an enemy who had recovered from the shock and begun to respond coherently. The Americans were already responding. Bastogne sat at the center of a road network that made it, in military terms, irreplaceable. 7 major roads converged at that Belgian market town. Ardennes, in the terrain of the Ardennes, where the forest canalized movement and the valleys dictated where armor could go and where it could not, those 7 roads meant that whoever held Bastogne controlled the operational arteries of the entire sector. The German plan required those roads. Without them, the armored columns would be confined to routes too narrow and too few to sustain the pace of advance that Antwerp demanded. The 101st Airborne Division reached Bastogne just ahead of the German encirclement. They arrived without their commander, who was in the United States recovering from injuries, and without much of their heavy equipment, which had been left behind in the haste of their movement. They arrived cold and under-equipped and outnumbered, and they dug in. The Germans surrounded them on December 20th. What followed was one of those military episodes that acquires, in retrospect, the quality of inevitability, as if the outcome were determined before it began, as if the defenders' refusal to yield were a fixed point around which the rest of the battle had to arrange itself. But it did not feel inevitable to the men inside Bastogne, who looked at their ammunition stocks and their medical supplies, and the ring of German armor pressing against their perimeter, and who understood with complete clarity that the mathematics of their situation were not favorable. On December 22nd, German General Heinrich von Luttwitz sent a formal demand for surrender. The message was delivered under white flag to the American command post, translated carefully, and handed to Acting Division Commander Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. McAuliffe read it. He set it on the table. "Nuts," he said. It was an expression of contempt and refusal. American vernacular that the German officers who received his written reply did not immediately understand. They had to ask what it meant. When it was explained, they withdrew and resumed their attacks. Kripe heard about McAuliffe's reply through a contact at Army Group B headquarters who had seen the translated exchange. He wrote it in his diary that night, and then he sat for a while before he wrote one additional sentence beneath it. One word, he wrote. Reality answered the fantasy with one word. He underlined it twice. The German advance stalled in stages, each stage reflecting one of the failures that Guderian and Model and Rundstedt had predicted with the precision of men who had spent their careers studying exactly these dynamics. Fuel was the first to go. The offensive had been planned around the assumption that German forces would capture American fuel dumps intact, that the speed of the advance would prevent Allied logisticians from destroying or evacuating the enormous stockpiles that sustained the American army in the field. It was an assumption that required American logistics officers to be slower and less competent than they actually were. They were not slow. They were not incompetent. The first major fuel dump that German spearheads approached had been emptied and the facilities destroyed before German armor arrived. The second was burning. The third had been relocated. The fuel that existed on German supply manifests, the fuel that the planners had entered into their calculations as available, was not, in most cases, armored where it needed to be when the tanks that needed it arrived. Columns began to slow, then to stop. Tanks that ran dry were pushed to the sides of roads by engineer crews who were trying to keep the arteries clear, and they sat there, hulking and immobile, while the columns that had to pass them created exactly the bottlenecks that the pre-offensive assessments had predicted. A single destroyed bridge, a single burning vehicle in the wrong place at the wrong time, could halt an entire armored column for hours on roads too narrow to permit bypass. The weather changed on December 23rd. It came with the abruptness that winter weather in the Ardennes could produce. Overnight, the fog and low cloud that had kept Allied aircraft grounded simply lifted, replaced by the kind of cold, clear sky that airmen call perfect flying weather. By the morning of the 23rd, the first Allied aircraft were over the battlefield. By afternoon, they were everywhere. Thousands of sorties over the following days. Fighter bombers hunting in the forest for the columns that the cleared roads and the churned snow and the smoke of stalled engines made visible to pilots who knew what to look for. Supply trucks burning on the roads that led back to the German start line. Bridge sites under constant attack, forcing engineers to work at night under fire to maintain the crossings that the advance required. The momentum that Hitler had insisted would carry his panzers to the Meuse and beyond evaporated in the cold air over Belgium, replaced by the grinding attrition of an offensive that had lost its speed without gaining its objectives. At Celle, the furthest point of German penetration, the 2nd Panzer Division's reconnaissance elements came within 4 miles of the Meuse River. 4 miles. They could see the river valley from elevated positions. They had no fuel to continue. The river stayed where it was. Patton moved in ways that violated everything the German planning had assumed about the pace of Allied operational response. The Third Army had been fighting south of the Ardennes when the German offensive began, turning it north, reversing the axis of an entire army, redirecting the supply lines and the movement orders, and the tactical planning of hundreds of thousands of men, was not something the German planners had believed was achievable in the time frame required. Patton did it in 72 hours. On December 22nd, while Bastogne was being surrounded, Patton told his staff he could attack north with 3 divisions within 48 hours. His staff thought he was being reckless. He was not being reckless. He was being Patton, which meant he had already been planning for this contingency before it became necessary, because he was the kind of commander who understood that the most dangerous thing a general can do is wait for the situation to clarify before beginning to prepare. On December 26th, elements of the 4th Armored Division broke through to Bastogne. The siege was lifted. The garrison held. The 7 roads remained in American hands. Guderian read the report in his Eastern Front headquarters and felt the particular grim confirmation that comes when a prediction you made and hoped was wrong turns out to have been entirely correct. He thought about Model, when out there in the forests, trying to sustain an offensive with forces that were running out of everything simultaneously. He thought about the men in the Panzer divisions, the last representatives of the armored force he had spent his professional life building, sitting in their tanks on the sides of Belgian roads, waiting for fuel that was not coming. He thought about the Eastern Front. The Soviet concentrations along the Vistula were not diminishing. They were growing. Then came December 24th, and Keitel sent his telegram. It was the most honest communication he had sent to Hitler in years. Perhaps the most honest communication he had sent to anyone in a position of authority since the day in 1941, when he had offered his resignation and learned the lesson that surviving in Hitler's orbit required the permanent suppression of whatever professional instincts had survived into the middle of the war. The telegram reported the situation on the ground, without the calibrations and modulations that Keitel had mastered over years of service. It said what the numbers said. It described what was happening to the offensive in the language of someone who had finally, at the end of everything, decided that accuracy mattered more than approval. He sent it. He waited. Hitler did not respond to the telegram. Instead, within 24 hours, my 3 generals at the front were dismissed from their commands. One was accused of insufficient aggression. One was accused of defeatism. One was accused of failing to follow orders with the determination that the situation required. None of them had sent honest telegrams. They had simply been the nearest available targets for the fury of a man who had received an accurate report and could not tolerate it. Keitel understood what the silence meant, understood it with the particular comprehension of a man who has spent years learning to read the signals that power sends when it does not want to speak directly. The one honest thing he had said in years had been received, processed, and answered by the punishment of men who had nothing to do with it. He would not send another telegram like that one. On January 12, 1945, Guderian's prediction arrived with the force of everything that had been inevitable about it. The Vistula-Oder offensive began before dawn, the way Soviet operations typically began. A massive artillery preparation that lasted over an hour, converting German forward positions into something that bore little resemblance to a defensive line, followed by armor and infantry in numbers that the depleted German forces facing them were structurally incapable of matching. Marshal Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front and Marshal Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front together deployed over 2 million men, more than 6,000 tanks, and artillery densities that their German opponents had not experienced even in the worst days of Bagration. Against them stood German forces that had been stripped of their best divisions and their most capable commanders to feed the Ardennes operation, formations that existed on paper at strengths their actual manning did not support, equipped with weapons their actual supply situation could not maintain. The German line did not crack. It dissolved. Within 48 hours, Soviet armor had achieved penetrations measured not in miles but in tens of miles. By the end of the first week, the front had advanced more than 100 miles. By the end of January, Soviet forces had crossed the Oder River and established bridgeheads on its western bank. The Oder River, 60 miles from Berlin. The armored divisions that might have blunted this advance, that might have bought time and trading space for the retreats that could have shortened the lines and preserved the forces needed to defend what remained. Those divisions were in the Ardennes. Some were still fighting. Some were already broken. Some were frozen in the snow and the mud of Belgium, their fuel gone and their maintenance impossible, and their crews doing what soldiers do when the situation requires them to do nothing, waiting and thinking and understanding at some level that the mathematics had stopped working in their favor. Guderian had told Hitler this would happen. He had said it in rooms and in memoranda, and in the careful, controlled language of a professional soldier presenting an assessment he knows may not be welcome. He had said it with numbers and with maps, and with the testimony of intelligence reports that documented Soviet preparations, with an accuracy that admitted no serious alternative interpretation. He had been heard and he had not been heard, and now the thing he had described was happening, and the description changed nothing about it. The Battle of the Bulge ended in late January 1945. The German forces that had attacked on December 16th were pushed back to approximately their starting positions, having gained and held nothing. More than 100,000 German soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. Hundreds of tanks and assault guns destroyed or abandoned. Fuel reserves that could not be replaced, consumed in an advance that reached 4 miles from the Meuse River and stopped. Were panzer divisions that had been rebuilt and hoarded for months, shattered in Belgian forests, unavailable for the defense of the Oder River line when the Soviet offensive came. The men who had been in the room on September 16th had made their assessments and their objections and their calculations. The assessments had been accurate. The objections had been overruled. The calculations had predicted precisely what happened. None of that changed what happened. Now came the accounting of what the knowing cost each man who had carried it. Rundstedt was captured by American forces in May 1945. He was considered for prosecution at Nuremberg but never charged. His age, 72 by then, and the difficulty of proving direct involvement in specific atrocities worked in his favor. He died in 1953, the last of the senior field marshals, and carrying with him whatever he had meant when he said that all conditions necessary for success were lacking. He had said it once. He had not needed to say it again. History recorded the statement and moved on, as history does, to the men whose stories had more dramatic endings. Keitel remained at Hitler's side until the very end. He was in the Führer bunker when Hitler married Eva Braun and then killed himself on April 30th, 1945. He signed the unconditional surrender documents in Berlin on May 8th, 1945, wearing the full dress uniform of a German field marshal, standing in front of cameras that recorded the moment for history. At Nuremberg, prosecutors presented evidence of his role in criminal orders, the Commissar Order, the Commando Order, directives that had led to the murder of thousands of people who had every right under the laws of war to be treated differently. When asked how he could have followed orders he knew to be criminal, he offered the defense that had been forming in him for years. I was merely following orders. The tribunal found it unconvincing. He was hanged on October 16, 1946. Jodl also stayed with Hitler until the collapse. He signed Germany's surrender at Reims on May 7, 1945. At Nuremberg, he was found guilty on all charges and hanged alongside Keitel. His widow spent decades trying to rehabilitate his reputation, eventually winning a posthumous ruling from a German denazification court that Jodl had been wrongly convicted. The ruling changed nothing for Jodl himself, and the 12 pages of analysis he had carried into Wolf's Lair on September 16th and never removed from his briefing folder were found after the war in a box of personal effects. They were exactly what Guderian had suspected they were: a thorough, accurate, professionally devastating assessment of why the offensive could not succeed. Jodl had known. He had written it down. He had brought it to the room. He had not taken it out. Kriepe was dismissed from his position 3 days after the September briefing and never held another significant command. He returned to civilian life after the war and lived quietly in a small city in southern Germany, in an apartment that his neighbors described as orderly and spare, belonging to a man who had reduced his circumstances to what he could manage and no longer seemed to want more than that. He kept his diary until the end of his life. When he died in 1967, his family found the notebooks in a locked case beneath his bed. There were 17 of them, covering the years from 1939 to 1966, written in the small, careful hand of a man who had learned early that precision in documentation was a form of respect for what was being documented. The notebooks covering 1944 and 1945 were the most detailed. They described what the official records did not: the private conversations, the assessments submitted and overruled, the expressions on men's faces in rooms where decisions were being made that everyone in the room knew were wrong. They described what it felt like to be in those rooms, which is something that official records never capture, because official records are written by people who understand that what it felt like is not the kind of information that official records are supposed to preserve. Kreipe's daughter donated the diaries to the Federal German Archives in 1971. They were cataloged and stored and eventually studied by historians who found in them a texture and specificity that the official records lacked. In the third notebook for 1944, on a page dated September 16th, Kreipe had written a single paragraph that historians would later return to more frequently than almost anything else in the collection. The paragraph described the end of the briefing, the maps being rolled up, the men filing out, the particular quality of the silence as they moved through the corridors of Wolf's Lair and back into the cold afternoon. The last sentence read, "I was in that room. I watched the moment when an empire chose the end of itself. No one shouted, no one wept. A finger pressed on a map, and we were silent. And that silence killed more than 100,000 men." Model received the order to hold his positions in late January as his army group was being encircled in the Ruhr pocket. He was 43 years old. He had been fighting continuously for 5 years. He had stabilized more collapsing fronts than he could easily count, had appeared in crisis after crisis, and found somehow the combination of tactical skill and personal force and absolute disregard for his own safety that the situation required. He had earned his reputation one impossible assignment at a time. The Ruhr pocket was not an assignment he could stabilize. More than 300,000 German soldiers were trapped in an area that was shrinking by the day as American forces closed the ring. The supply lines were severed. The ammunition was running out. The men were hungry. The officers were receiving orders from a high command that was itself disintegrating, from a leadership structure that had lost contact with reality in September 1944 and had never recovered it. Model watched the situation and understood it with the clarity that had always been his defining quality as a commander. He issued orders disbanding his army group on April 15, 1945. He told his officers they were released from their duty to him. He encouraged the young ones to surrender. He told the older ones to change into civilian clothes and find their families. He kept nothing for himself. On April 21, 1945, in a forest near Duisburg, Walter Model walked away from the last of his staff. He walked alone into the trees, and he put a pistol to his head. He was 43 years old. He had left one sentence written on a small piece of paper and found with his body. A German field marshal does not surrender. Guderian learned of Model's death through a terse report that reached him in the chaos of the final weeks. He read it and set it on the desk and sat with it for a long time. He thought about the night of December 15th, the cold coffee, the clear sky above the forest, the obligation Model had named in that last conversation, the thing that witnesses owed to the consequences of knowing. Model had known. He had said it plainly in the language he preferred: direct, operational, without decoration. He had told anyone who would listen, in every professional form available to him, that the plan had not a leg to stand on. He had submitted his alternative. He had been overruled. He had then done what German officers were expected to do. He had applied himself to the execution of orders he believed were wrong, with everything he had, because the professional culture he had been shaped by demanded it. And in the end, alone in a forest, he had made the only final decision he could make that was entirely his own. Guderian survived. He was removed from his position on March 28, 1945, after an explosive confrontation with Hitler that left witnesses shaken, one of the last in a series of shouting matches that had escalated as the situation deteriorated. As Guderian persisted in presenting information that Hitler did not want and making requests that Hitler did not want to grant. Hitler sent him on indefinite sick leave. It was the third time in the war that his career had effectively ended because he had insisted on telling the truth. Unlike the previous 2 times, there was no recall. He surrendered to American forces in May 1945. He was held for 3 years while investigators determined whether charges should be brought. They were not. He was released in 1948 and spent the years that followed writing his memoirs, a document that presented Heinz Guderian as a professional soldier of the highest integrity, a man who had fought for Germany and not for National Socialism, who had spoken truth to power at every juncture and been ignored. The memoirs were widely read. They shaped how the Western world understood the German military during the Second World War for decades. They served the interests of a Cold War alliance that needed to believe the German officer corps had been fundamentally different from the regime it served. They were not entirely dishonest. Guderian had spoken truth to power at intervals and through carefully chosen channels. He had filed his memoranda and made his objections known, and sat in rooms where he had not agreed with what was being done. But the memoirs did not mention the court of honor, did not mention the names of the men he had voted to expel, the colleagues delivered thereby into the hands of Roland Freisler's People's Court, and the executions that followed, did not discuss the complexity of surviving in a criminal regime at a senior level, the specific, concrete compromises required, the places where resistance had been available and had not been chosen, the choices that were always present even when the costs were high. The memoirs created a Guderian that Guderian could live with. The man who actually existed was more complicated, but there was one document the memoirs did not include. In 1990, a researcher working through the original manuscript held in a private archive found pages that had been excised before publication, removed not by an editor but by Guderian himself in his own handwriting, with a single line drawn through each paragraph. In those pages, Guderian had written about Walter Model. He had written that Model was the only man in that briefing room on September 16, 1944, who had fully understood what professional duty required, not the duty to execute orders, but the duty to say clearly, without qualification, that the orders could not achieve their stated purpose. He had written that Model had done this, and had been overruled, and had executed the operation anyway, and had died in a forest alone at 43 years old. He had written, "I have spent years explaining what I did and why. I have not found a satisfactory explanation for why Model did what he did and I did not." Then he drew a line through it and removed it from the manuscript. The line he drew was still visible. Someone had preserved the page rather than destroying it for reasons that were never recorded. The man who survived wrote about himself. The man who died left one sentence on a piece of paper in a forest. History remembered both, but only one of them had nothing left to explain. The machine moved regardless. It always moved regardless. That was the point of the machine. They had been in the room. They had seen the map. They had done the calculations. And the offensive happened anyway. Not because they failed to object, but because objection in that system had been designed to accomplish nothing. What Kriepe understood in the small apartment where he spent his later years, with his notebooks stacked in their locked case, was that bearing witness was not nothing. It was not enough. It was never enough to save the men who died. But it was not nothing. The record existed. The numbers existed. The 11 seconds of silence existed, written in a notebook by a 40-year-old Air Force officer who had been in the room and had written down what he saw because someone had to. Kriepe's daughter, when she donated the diaries, Ina wrote a short letter that accompanied the donation. In it, she described finding her father at his desk on the last evening of his life, the notebooks open in front of him, reading back through pages he had written 20 years before. She asked him what he was looking for. He told her he was not looking for anything. He was making sure it was all still there. It was all still there. The last entry in Kriepe's diary for 1944 was written on December 31st. Outside his window, the new year was arriving with the minimal ceremony that a country fighting for its survival could muster. He wrote for a long time. He wrote about the year that was ending, not the official version, the version of communique and announcements and the careful language of a regime that described catastrophes as strategic readjustments. But the version he had witnessed from inside the rooms where the decisions were made. At the end of the entry, he wrote 2 sentences. The first, "History will call this madness, and history will be right." The second, "But madness does not explain the silence of the men who knew better." He closed the notebook. Outside, the new year arrived, and in the forests of the Ardennes, in the cold that did not care about calendars or accounting, or the questions that men asked themselves at the end of years that had cost more than any accounting could capture. The snow continued to fall on the dead. It fell on the burned-out tanks at Celle, 4 miles from the river that was never crossed. It fell on the frozen roads where German columns had stalled and died. It fell on ground that had been 4 years before, on the scene of Guderian's greatest triumph, the forest he had looked at and seen possibility, where others saw only obstruction, the terrain he had used to change the course of a war. It fell on all of it equally, the way snow falls, without judgment or memory, covering what had been done there until the landscape looked clean again. Until you could walk through those forests on a winter morning and hear only the birds and the wind in the pines and feel nothing of what had happened among those trees. Until the ground itself seemed to have forgotten. But the notebooks were still there, under the bed, in the locked case, in the handwriting of a man who had understood that forests forget and men forget and institutions forget, but that the written word, if preserved, does not. Someone had been in the room. Someone had counted the seconds, so someone had written it down. That was not nothing. In the long reckoning of what the knowing required, and what the silence cost, and what the men who carried that weight owed to the men who died under it, it was not nothing. It was perhaps the only thing that remained. There is a particular quality to the silences that surround great catastrophes. The silences before they begin, when the people who understand what is coming have said what they can say, and watched it accomplish nothing, and the silences after they end. When the survivors are left to construct their explanations and their justifications and their carefully edited accounts of what they knew and when they knew it and what, if anything, they did about it. The silence in that briefing room on September 16th, 1944, lasted 11 seconds. Kripe counted them, and he wrote the number down, and the number survived because the notebook survived, and the notebook survived because Kripe carried it with him when he left Wolf's Lair 3 days later and never went back. 11 seconds. In 11 seconds, 4 men understood, each in his own way, at his own depth, with his own particular combination of professional clarity and self-protective limitation, that they were watching the beginning of the end. Not the end of the war, though the offensive that began that September afternoon would accelerate it. Not the end of Germany, though the resources consumed in the Ardennes would hasten the collapse of what remained of German resistance. But the end of something more specific and in some ways more terrible. The end of the pretense that the men at the top of the German military apparatus were engaged in professional military activity. The pretense that the deliberations at Wolf's Lair constituted genuine strategic thinking. The pretense that the outcome of those deliberations bore any necessary relationship to the realities they were supposed to address. That pretense had been eroding for years. It had been damaged at Stalingrad when Hitler had refused to authorize Paulus's breakout and the Sixth Army had been destroyed. It had been damaged in the Kursk planning when Hitler had delayed the offensive until German armor could be destroyed more efficiently by improved Soviet anti-tank weapons. And it had been damaged every time the gap between the map in Hitler's mind and the map on the conference table had been papered over by the professional skill of men whose job was to make the impossible sound achievable. But on September 16, 1944, the pretense did not merely erode. It collapsed completely in the space of 11 seconds in front of 4 men who could see it collapsing and could do nothing to stop it and would spend the rest of their lives in very different ways trying to account for what they had witnessed and what it had cost. Guderian spent that time writing. His memoirs were a substantial work, detailed, technically sophisticated, full of the operational analysis that had characterized his professional thinking throughout his career. They were also, in the ways that mattered most, a work of self-presentation rather than self-examination. He wrote about what he had done and why, about the decisions he had made and the reasoning behind them, about the constraints under which he had operated and the ways in which those constraints had limited what was possible. He did not write about the court of honor. He wrote around it, past it, over it, in the way that accomplished writers can write around the things they are most afraid to address directly, touching the edges, acknowledging the existence of the period without dwelling on its content, moving quickly to what came before and after without lingering on what happened during. The pages he removed from the manuscript and drew lines through. The pages about Model, while the admission that he could not explain why Model had done what he did and he had not, were not the only pages he removed. There were others. Pages about specific decisions in specific rooms where specific things were said and specific choices were made. Pages that contained the kind of granular, intimate self-knowledge that memoirs typically conceal, because the point of memoirs is not self-knowledge, but self-presentation, not understanding but justification. He drew lines through them and they were not published. He survived until 1954, long enough to see his reputation largely established in the form he had constructed for it, long enough to know that the narrative he had written would outlast the period in which its contradictions might easily be checked against the surviving evidence. He died in Bavaria in a town that was quiet and clean and bore no obvious marks of the catastrophe he had helped to shape and had tried in his way to resist and had ultimately served because service was what he knew, and the costs of the alternative were ones he had calculated and found prohibitive. The man he had drawn lines through, the man in the deleted pages, the man he could not explain, died in a forest near Duisburg on April 21, 1945, and was buried where he fell by soldiers who had served under him and who understood, in the way that soldiers sometimes understand things about their commanders that the commanders cannot see about themselves, that they were burying someone who had answered the question that Guderian could not answer, in the only way it could be answered once the other options were gone. Model had been 43 years old. He had been a field marshal for less than a year. He had stabilized more fronts and been given more impossible assignments than any commander in the German army, and he had executed them with a professionalism and a personal courage that his men respected absolutely. And he had done all of this in service of a regime and a leadership structure that had squandered everything he built and killed the men he led and consumed in a few months of Belgian winter, fighting the last reserves he had spent years accumulating. He had told them the plan had no leg to stand on. He had written the alternative. He had been overruled. He had done his job anyway. And when his army group was encircled and the last thing he could do for the men under his command was release them from the obligation to follow him any further, he had done that too. He had walked into the trees alone, which was a kind of answer to the question Guderian could not answer, though it was not the answer that history would have chosen for him had history been given a choice. There is a photograph that does not exist, taken by a camera that was not there, of the forest near Duisburg on the morning of April 22, 1945. In the photograph that does not exist, the trees are bare, and the ground is cold, and a light snow has fallen overnight, covering the tracks that led away from the road and into the trees. The tracks stop at a particular spot, and there is nothing in the photograph to indicate what happened at that spot. And the trees look exactly as trees always look in early spring before the leaves come. Patient, indifferent, there before the men who moved among them, and still thereafter. The forest did not know what had happened in it. The forest did not remember. In the spring, the leaves would come back, and the ground would soften, and the tracks would disappear, and there would be nothing to indicate that a man had walked in from the road and made a decision there, alone, in the cold. But Kreipe's notebook was still there, in the locked case under the bed. And the entry for April was still there, the careful small handwriting documenting what Kreipe had learned from the officers who had been present, the facts and the circumstances and the one sentence on the piece of paper. And the entry for September 16, 1944 was still there, when with its 11 seconds and its finger on the map and its silence that killed more than 100,000 men. The notebook did not forget. That was the point of the notebook. That was why Kreipe had kept it under the bed for 20 years, why he had locked the case and kept the key, why on the last evening of his life he had sat at his desk and read back through pages he had written 2 decades before, making sure it was all still there. It was all still there. The forest forgets. The institutions forget. The men who survive write their memoirs and draw their lines and construct the versions of themselves they can live with. But the notebook does not forget, and the number 11 does not change, and the finger on the map is still pressed down on the same spot it was pressed on in September of 1944. And the silence is still 11 seconds long. Some things, once written down, do not disappear. That was what Kripke understood, sitting at his desk on the last evening of his life, reading back through what he had written. Not that the record would change anything, not that the documentation would undo what had been done, or restore the men who had been lost, or answer the question of what should have happened instead of what did happen. The record would not do any of those things, but it would exist. And existing, it would mean that the men who had been in that room, who had stood in that concrete bunker on a September afternoon and watched a finger come down on a map and understood what it meant, could not be said to have passed through history without leaving a mark. Could not be reduced to the versions of themselves they had constructed in their memoirs or the silences they had maintained about the things they preferred not to address. They had been there. They had known. And because Kripke had been there too, and had written it down, and had kept the notebooks under the bed in the locked case until the end of his life, their knowing was preserved alongside theirs. This was not justice. It was not redemption. It was not the kind of resolution that stories are supposed to provide. The moment when the meaning crystallizes and the weight lifts, and the people who carried the impossible burden of knowing are released from it by the recognition that their knowing mattered. It was only the record. Only the fact of having been witnessed, of having been written down, of having been preserved in the small, careful handwriting of a man who had understood that bearing witness was sometimes the only form of honesty available, and that honesty, even when it could not prevent the catastrophe, was still owed to the people the catastrophe consumed. The snow fell on the Ardennes. The notebook stayed in the locked case. The 11 seconds stayed in the notebook. And the men who had been in the room, who had stood in the silence and felt the weight of knowing settle into them, and had carried that weight for the rest of their lives in their different ways, to their different ends, became through the record something more than what their memoirs had made them. They became, in Kripke's careful handwriting, the men who had been there, who had known, who had said what could be said and watched it accomplish nothing and gone on carrying the weight because the weight was what the knowing cost. That was all. That was everything. That was what was owed.